Carlos is sitting in his Havana apartment, drenched in the kind of heat that makes you question all life decisions. The fan? Dead. The fridge? A warm, sad box of what used to be food. And the lights? Forget about it. As he stares at the flickering candle, barely keeping the darkness at bay, he can't help but remember the good old days. You know, when electricity was a thing you could actually count on. Those were the times when the promises of the revolution still felt within reach, when Cuba seemed poised to defy the odds and carve out its own path. One that didn't rely on the capitalist powers that surrounded it. But now, all that feels like a distant memory. So, what went wrong? How did Cuba, once defiant in the face of global pressures, find itself here in the dark? Let's take a step back to the days when the seeds of Cuba's current situation were sown. Before 1959, the year that ushered in the birth of a new Cuba, the island was a land defined by contradictions. For the wealthy elite and foreign tourists, especially Americans, Cuba was paradise. Havana was the Caribbean's crown jewel, a bustling metropolis filled with lavish hotels, glittering casinos, and a nightlife that rivaled any in the world. The island's sugar plantations, largely owned by American corporations, made it a key player in global trade. But while the wealthy enjoyed the spoils, the vast majority of Cubans lived a very different reality. In the countryside, poverty was rampant. Landless peasants worked long hours for meager wages, often under brutal conditions. Healthcare and education were privileges reserved for the rich. Corruption was widespread, and President Fulgencio Batista's government catered to the interests of foreign businesses rather than its own people. As economic disparity grew, so did resentment. Beneath the glitz and glamour of Havana, a revolutionary fervor was taking shape, particularly among students and intellectuals who were fed up with the status quo. Fidel Castro, a young lawyer turned revolutionary, emerged as the voice of the disenfranchised. He promised to overthrow the corrupt Batista regime and create a fairer, more just Cuba. As the situation became more dire, support for Castro's movement grew. His speeches inspired hope among the poor, and by 1956, Castro and his small band of guerrillas had taken to the mountains to wage war against Batista's forces. But this war for Cuba's future wouldn't just change the country's political landscape, it would alter its place on the world stage forever. As the revolution brewed in the hills, an undercurrent of hope mixed with fear. Little did anyone know the world was watching closely, and the decisions made in the coming years would push Cuba into an unexpected and unprecedented direction, straight into the heart of communism. The year was 1959. After years of guerrilla warfare, Castro's forces finally marched into Havana, victorious. Batista had fled the country, and the Cuban people celebrated the dawn of a new era. To many, Fidel Castro was a hero, a man who had fought for the downtrodden and delivered them from tyranny. With Batista gone, the Cuban Revolution became a beacon of hope, especially for the poor who had suffered under his regime. Castro's message was clear. Cuba would no longer be the playground of foreign powers, and the wealth of the nation would be shared among its people. Almost immediately, land reforms were put into place. Large estates were broken up and redistributed to ordinary citizens. The government nationalized industries and foreign businesses, taking control of banks, sugar mills, and even casinos. Education and healthcare became universally accessible, and Cuba's literacy rate soared within just a few years. But Castro's revolution was more than just about internal reforms. It was also a sharp rejection of U.S. influence. In a Cold War world divided between capitalism and communism, Cuba found itself increasingly at odds with its northern neighbor. As tensions between the U.S. and Cuba escalated, Castro made a decision that would define Cuba's trajectory for decades to come. He aligned his government with the Soviet Union. In doing so, Cuba became the first communist state in the Western Hemisphere. For Castro, this partnership with the Soviet Union was crucial for survival. With the U.S. embargo strangling the Cuban economy, Soviet aid provided the lifeline the revolution needed. But this new alliance came at a cost. The Cold War chessboard had shifted, and Cuba would soon find itself at the center of one of the most dangerous confrontations in modern history. The revolution had brought change, But as the Cold War intensified, Cuba's position on the global stage became increasingly precarious. What followed next wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a gamble that would bring the world to the brink of nuclear war. October 1962, the world held its breath. U.S. surveillance planes had discovered Soviet missile installations in Cuba, just 90 miles from American shores. In response, President John F. Kennedy demanded the immediate removal of the missiles and imposed a naval blockade around the island. What followed was a 13-day standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, a standoff that could have easily spiraled into global nuclear war. For Cuba, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Fidel Castro, believing the U.S. would invade at any moment, saw the missiles as essential for his country's defense. The Cuban government had willingly accepted the Soviet Union's offer to station nuclear missiles on the island as a deterrent against future U.S. aggression. But what Castro couldn't have anticipated was just how close this decision would bring the world to disaster. As the crisis unfolded, the world watched in terror, knowing that one wrong move could result in unprecedented destruction. Tensions were at an all-time high. Soviet ships steamed toward the U.S. naval blockade, while American military forces were placed on the highest alert. For 13 days, the fate of humanity hung in the balance. Finally, a secret deal was reached. The Soviets agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba. In addition, the U.S. secretly agreed to remove its own missiles from Turkey, though this was kept under wraps at the time. The missiles may have been removed, but Cuba's dependence on the Soviet Union had deepened. And as the years wore on, this reliance would come back to haunt them, especially when the Soviet Union itself began to crumble. In 1991, the unthinkable happened. The Soviet Union, Cuba's greatest ally and lifeline, collapsed. For Cuba, this was an economic catastrophe. The island nation had relied on Soviet oil, food, and financial aid for decades, and with the USSR's sudden disintegration, that support evaporated overnight. The result was what became known as the Special Period, a time of severe economic hardship and scarcity unlike anything Cuba had faced before. The Cuban economy, which had already been struggling under the weight of the U.S. embargo, was now plunged into chaos. Fuel shortages meant that public transportation all but disappeared, and food became so scarce that people resorted to growing vegetables in urban areas just to survive. Even the electricity that once powered Havana's iconic nightlife was reduced to a trickle. Rolling blackouts became the norm, and many days, entire neighborhoods would be left without power for hours on end. But in typical Cuban fashion, the people found ways to adapt. The government promoted organic farming and renewable energy, and the use of bicycles became widespread as fuel shortages made cars useless. Despite the overwhelming difficulties, social programs like healthcare and education were maintained, though the quality suffered under the strain. The Special Period was a time of great suffering, but also one of resilience. Cuba had weathered yet another storm. However, the scars of the Special Period run deep, and many of the problems that emerged during this time, particularly the energy shortages, have never truly been resolved. As Cuba struggled through the Special Period, it became clear that the island's energy crisis was not just a temporary setback, but a chronic issue. And today, as blackouts once again sweep across the island, the question remains: why, after all these years, is Cuba still in the dark? On October 18, 2024, just before noon, Cuba once again finds itself in the grip of widespread blackouts. The Antonio Guterres power plant, the country's largest, went offline, plunging half the country into total darkness. The power loss hit 1.64 gigawatts during peak hours, leaving Cubans without electricity in an already tough economic situation. But the energy crisis plaguing the island today is not just a repeat of the Special Period. It's a symptom of deeper, more systemic issues. At the heart of the issue is Cuba's aging and inefficient power grid. Much of the country's energy infrastructure was built decades ago and has seen little in the way of modernization. The power plants that do exist are primarily fueled by imported oil, most of which used to come from Venezuela. However, Venezuela's own economic collapse has severely reduced its ability to export oil to Cuba, leaving the island in a precarious position. In an attempt to address this, the Cuban government has invested in renewable energy sources, such as wind and solar power. However, these projects have been slow to develop and insufficient to meet the island's growing energy needs. Additionally, ongoing U.S. sanctions have made it difficult for Cuba to import the necessary technology and materials to upgrade its power grid. On top of all this, Cuba has been hit by a series of hurricanes in recent years, which have caused extensive damage to its already fragile energy infrastructure. Each time the island begins to recover, another storm sets back progress, leaving many Cubans to wonder if the blackouts will ever truly end. For many, the current crisis feels like history is repeating itself. The lights go out and once again they're left sitting in the dark, wondering when things will get better. But for all of Cuba's challenges the country has endured, the blackouts, the embargoes, the economic crises, they haven't broken the Cuban spirit. The question is, how has Cuba survived for so long under a system that many expected to collapse? For decades, outsiders have predicted the fall of Cuba's communist government. Yet, despite the hardships, the system has persisted. The question of how Cuba has survived this long is not an easy one to answer. It's a combination of factors, both internal and external, that have kept the island afloat. One key factor is Cuba's social programs. Despite the economic challenges, the Cuban government has maintained a commitment to providing healthcare and education for all its citizens. Cuba's healthcare system, in particular, is renowned for its high-quality care and low costs, and Cuban doctors are often sent abroad to help in international medical missions. These programs have fostered a sense of loyalty among many Cubans, who view them as significant achievements of the revolution. Cuba's survival is also due in part to its ability to adapt. During the special period when fuel and food were scarce, the government encouraged urban farming and embraced renewable energy. While these measures were born out of necessity, they have since become an integral part of Cuban life. The government has also opened up certain sectors of the economy to private enterprise, allowing small businesses to operate within a tightly controlled framework. Internationally, Cuba has managed to maintain relationships with key allies, despite its isolation from the U.S. In recent years, countries like China and Russia have provided economic assistance, while tourism has become a vital source of income. Millions of visitors from around the world come to experience Cuba's rich culture, its music, and its history, bringing much-needed foreign currency to the island. But despite these measures, the cracks in the system are becoming more apparent. The question of how long Cuba can continue to survive under its current model is one that looms large over the country's future. As Cuba stands at a crossroads, facing mounting challenges from within and without, the future of the island is more uncertain than ever. But with every crisis comes the possibility of change. Do you have personal experiences or insights about life in Cuba today? Share them with us in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe for more content like this.